Ms. Seba, you must. Ms. Seba, you live?
Okay, go.
She just dropped off.
Okay, so you want me to start? Yes?
Yeah, I think you are live already, Ms. Seba.
Okay, great. Sorry about that. Assalamu alaikum. Peace and blessings be to everybody. We thank Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for bringing us all together on such a beautiful day, and we send salutations to our beloved Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, his family and his companions. Welcome to Turning Fury into Courage, Decolonising Education. My name is Nina Alexia Bratso, and I'm the chairperson of Rahasia Mafusa NPO, which was launched in April 2016 at the District 6 Museum. The vision is to bridge the gap between segregated communities as a result of apartheid, with the mission of raising the consciousness of the ramifications and repercussions of racial and cultural prejudice using events like this. I would like to give special thanks to Umran TV and ITV in supporting this project, hereby strengthening one of our key objectives in establishing the links to ancestral and historical past for all South Africans, ascertaining bonds between the Nusantara and South Africa. The guest speakers will each talk about understanding colonization and how we can all contribute to make effort in decolonizing our minds. We particularly hope from these webinars that we can bring together the people in Singapore, Malaysia, South Africa, Indonesia, UK, and ultimately closer to humanity as a whole. This is a third series in a time for social transformation and movement building. This was brought about through the desire to bring great minds and personalities together and acknowledging that whilst we are amidst uncertain times of the COVID-19 pandemic, this is indeed an opportunity that we must seize to not go back to normal that simply was not good enough and fraught with inequalities and issues to be addressed. We agree that the pandemic has merely highlighted things that were already there and intensified them. This theme for the episode of Decolonizing Education has taken shape over the months of discussions, each enabling their unique perspectives from 3 continents, bringing a more holistic, wholesome response than if it was just one region or one city, which I also believe is the nature of the theme. Each speaker will provide a talk for around 10 minutes, moderated by SHABODIEN ROOMANAY, and followed by a Q&A. First, we will have the Honourable Dr. Professor Syed FARID ALATAS, live from Singapore. I met him in 2018 and we have been acquainted ever since with our similar passions. Syed FARID is currently a Professor of Sociology at the National University of Singapore. He has previously headed the Department of Malay Studies, lectured at the University of Malaya in the Department of Southeast Asian Studies, and a research associate at the Women and Human Resources Unit, University Sains Malaysia. He has penned an impressive and influential collection of published books and articles offering philosophical and theological revival of Islamic knowledge, whilst critiquing Western imperialism, domestic post-colonization, and reviving theory that would help the global South. Of particular interest is alternative discourses in Asian social science, responses to Eurocentrism, which contextualizes the problems surrounding the state of the social sciences by pointing to the historical and continuing dominance over Asian social sciences discourses by Western concepts. Critiques include Eurocentrism, the captive mind, and both academic imperialism and dependency for decolonized knowledge and for indigenized social sciences. Next, we will have CAMILLO ZIMBA, live from Johannesburg, who is passionate about reinstalling passion for mathematics in students by expanding the curriculum into the arts such as poetry and painting to add much colour needed to the content of the curriculum. He taps into the depths of knowledge in emotional intelligence, spirituality, traditional African teaching methods, and the techniques that will bring out the individual learner's potential. He has worked with students in public as well as private schools in South Africa, while successfully running his private tutoring business called Brilliant Brains. In a backdrop of a society with polarizing extremes of class, ZIMBA is conscientious, mindful, and enabled with the ability to apply and serve his knowledge to those in the townships, in addition to the elite. CAMILLO has a keen interest in astrology and endowed with a unique perception to sense things in the world with published works, including Deaf Poet Inc.'s Let Me Speak, by the author name of Mubarak. He is also curious on the Islamization and Africanization of the current curriculum as a means of creating decolonial thought in education. He will be breaking down digestible steps to decolonizing the educational system as an introduction and provide a proposed 5 key figures in understanding colonism to implement in our educational systems. Last but not finally least, we have RIZWANA REHMAN, live from London, who has been teaching religious studies for more than 15 years and has led departments within different schools in London. She has a master's in religious education from the University College of London, where she looked at aspects of the philosophy of education and the educational models employed throughout the Muslim world. She has a keen interest in alternative education and to transform the education so that it shows other perspectives that reflect its diversity and social fabric of Britain. RIZWANA acts in an advisory capacity for the teaching and provision for religious education in London, supporting teachers to develop good practice in teaching religion and beliefs in a changing and multicultural Britain. RIZWANA has a keen interest in different educational models and was actively involved in the management and setup of the Alamiya School, which is a Montessori-based infant school. This was set up in 2012 in a response to a number of homeschooling Muslim parents actively seeking a more organic learning environment for their children. I will be handing over to SHABODIEN in a moment, who I would like to introduce to. He is a welcome moderator in this subject, having been the principal of Islamia College, one of the most prestigious Muslim schools in South Africa. He chairs the board of the Company of Muslim Views, which is a national newspaper in South Africa. It is the only viable paper for the community and known for its staunchly anti-apartheid since during the reign of the nationalist movement for the last 20 years. It has since won numerous accolades for content, design, and journalism for its writers. He also serves on an advisory capacity in a number of organisations for the good of the society. Live from Cape Town, SHABODIEN, you are welcome to take over the proceedings.
Thank you. Thank you, Nusayba. That was really unnecessary, but thank you very much. I think we can dig into what is a delicious topic for today. Welcome once again to viewers from ITV and also from Umran TV in Jakarta. More importantly, welcome again, once again to the participants today. We have an august body of intellectuals. We are pleased who have volunteered to tackle the topic. Today's topic is decolonizing education. I will, without further ado, ask Professor FARID ALATAS. You have about 10 minutes. I'm not going to cut you off at the 10-minute point, but if we can try and stick to the 10 minutes, but don't fear if you're making an important point at the time, we'll allow you a little bit of extra time. Professor ALATAS.
Thank you very much, Mr. Shabodien. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh to everyone. Let me just get straight away to the point. We are talking about decolonization of education. This is part of a larger concern with decolonizing knowledge, decolonizing knowledge production. And the reason why we are still talking about decolonization, you know, decades after the political independence of former colonies, you know, the former British, Dutch, French, Portuguese colonies around the world. The reason why we are still talking about decolonization is because there has been a view that coloniality is still with us. We are still, as far as knowledge production is concerned, we still exist in a state of coloniality. Now, that might be difficult for many people to understand, especially people of the younger generation. As far as my generation is concerned, our parents grew up in the colonial period, and they understood, they were born in the colonial period, and they witnessed political decolonization. They lived during the period of independence of many states, and they understood what it meant for their culture, for their economic systems, for their knowledge production systems, educational systems, to be dominated by foreign powers, by alien powers. And they understood what it meant for their destiny to be taken out of their own hands. And I think my generation understands that also to some extent, because we heard about these matters from our parents. We heard, you know, stories, we heard about incidences, we heard about disasters, about sometimes even catastrophes. Whether the form of colonialism was brutal or relatively benign, as they say, we know something about the experience. Now, one thing we know about colonialism is that it destroyed the indigenous local knowledge systems of the societies, of the peoples that were colonized. And we are still in a situation, we are still in a state where we are trying to revive those knowledge systems. We are still trying to discover the worldviews, the texts, the concepts, the ideas that were written about, that were discussed, that informed the way people thought in pre-colonial times. And this has something to do with the goal of decolonization. Now, perhaps the best expression of this need to decolonize took place or can be seen in the attempt at Asian and African solidarity. You know, I'm referring to the famous Bandung conference, which was convened in the 1950s, in 1955 to be exact. So I think about 29 countries from Asia and Africa got together to talk about a kind of third worldism, to talk about solidarity within the South. And part of their concern was, of course, to consolidate and to continue the process of decolonization. Of course, this was after decolonization, political decolonization. Many of these countries had become independent or were in the process of becoming independent. But there was recognition that there was a need to go beyond political decolonization. There was a need to develop a certain degree of economic independence from the Western powers, and also from the Eastern Bloc, and also to develop local indigenous knowledge systems that were deemed to be more relevant to understanding the problems of societies in what used to be called then the Third World, which we now usually refer to as the Global South. Unfortunately, many of the politicians, many of the governments in the 60s and the 70s forgot about these efforts. And nowadays we hear very little about Asian African solidarity or solidarity within the Third World or within the Global South. And I'm therefore, you know, I received some, I found myself being encouraged with the recent emergence of the Black Lives Matter movement, because in a way that has functioned to unite many peoples across the world. Although it concerns, initially it concerned African Americans, but it spread to the UK, and it has even come to our part of the world. I'm speaking about, you know, Malaysia and Singapore, because within the context of Black Lives Matter, there was a revival of discourse on the appropriateness of certain statues, the appropriateness of statues. The question was, should these statues remain where they are? What do they represent? Do they represent appropriate values for our society? You know, for example, should you have a statue of a Confederate soldier, a statue which glorifies a Confederate soldier? And these kind of questions have been asked also of, you know, the statues of colonial rulers, colonial officers. In South Africa, of course, you have the famous example of Cecil Rhodes, and you had the Rhodes Must Fall movement. And people are asking the same question about Stamford Raffles in Singapore, Francis Light in Penang, the so-called colonial founder of Penang in the late 18th century. So Black Lives Matter has resulted in these discussions. And indeed, the discussion about the statues, about whether the statues should fall, is part of the larger issue of decolonization. Because when you have a statue of a colonial ruler in Singapore or Malaysia, it suggests the question as to what extent are our minds still colonized, that we tend to glorify, you know, the colonial past. In the case of colonizers, the statues of colonizers in the West itself, such as Cecil Rhodes in the United Kingdom, it raises a question among the descendants of the colonizers as to what extent their own minds as colonizers needs to be decolonized. So I think if, you know, we just take the example of these statues, we can see that there is really decades after political decolonization, there is still the deeply felt problem of colonization, which has affected the minds not only of the colonized, but also the colonizer. So I guess this is one point that we should stress, that the minds that need to be decolonized are not only those of the colonized, but also the colonizer. The colonizer also has to undergo some decolonization. My time is almost up, so I'd like to just make one more point. When we talk about decolonizing at the level of education, it means re-evaluating our views, our perspectives, our theories, our concepts in a number of fields, in history, in sociology, in anthropology, in psychology, and indeed all of the social sciences and humanities. What is important, of course, are the perspectives. Now, if we look at the early attempts to decolonize knowledge, one of the earliest scholars who did this was the Filipino thinker and activist Jose Rizal, who died in 1896. He was executed by the Spaniards, the Spanish colonial government in the Philippines. Now, just to give you an example of what it means to decolonize knowledge, Jose Rizal was probably the first thinker to question the colonial construction of the lazy native. The Spaniards, and not only the Spaniards, the Dutch and the British, the Portuguese, constructed the idea that the native was inherently lazy and incapable, and therefore not qualified to rule themselves. And this discourse was something that was internalized by the natives themselves. So Rizal was probably the first to systematically oppose such a discourse, to explain that the natives actually were rational, were capable, were progressive. In pre-colonial times, they controlled trade routes. They were, advanced in certain kinds of industry and in scholarship and so on and so forth. So he rewrote Filipino history from a native point of view and in an anti-colonial, non-Eurocentric manner. So this is sort of roughly what we mean by decolonizing knowledge. And I think we look at the roots of the decolonization of knowledge efforts. Rizal was probably one of the first in the South. We also have Binoy Kumar Sarkar, who was writing during the 1910s and 1920s from India, from Bengal. He was probably one of the first also to critique the European study of India, what was called Indology. And then, of course, much later on in the 1950s, in the 60s, you have a series of thinkers that come from the African diaspora. You have Frantz Fanon, you have Aimé Césaire, you have Kenyatta, you have Solinka, you have Achebe, and then others also from Latin America. So across Asia, Africa, and Latin America, you have a long tradition that goes back more than 100 years of thinking in a decolonial way. And this is, I think, what we want to encourage. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Professor FARID ALATAS. Just to quickly wrap, he was saying that coloniality is still with us. It's not gone away. And more effort should be made to try and kind of revive indigenous knowledge systems. He referred to the Bandung Conference of 1955, and more importantly, the current debate around the issue of statues and its impact on people's understanding of their own background, their own history, etc. Interestingly, Jose Rizal is a well-known thinker and academic who did talk about the need for decolonizing, and then he referred to also Kumar Sarkar from India, who also talked and wrote extensively around the issue of decolonization. So it kind of sets the template for us to talk about the impact of decolonization. Without further ado, I will now head to CAMILLO ZIMBA, also known as Mubarak, to give us his particular views. I see he's sitting with the chairman next to him on his lap. CAMILLO.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Salam.
Alhamdulillah. Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad al-Fatih lima ughliqa wal khatib lima sabaq nasir al-haq bil haq wal hadi ila siratal mustaqim wa ala alihi haqqa qadri mudari al-azim. Greetings to all the viewers throughout the world. My name is CAMILLO Mubarak ZIMBA, and I would like to perhaps share a mixture of minds, so to speak, to put it in a poetic form, that have influenced me quite considerably. And the interaction of these 5 individuals in the context of colonialization, as we've just heard from Professor, the tradition is quite old, well over 100 years, you know. But in my experience, I've noticed that a lot of people have a disconnect in terms of how the system actually comes together, right? And you're left sort of putting a whole lot of energy in a direction that you're not really certain whether you're having an effect in that direction or not. Yes. Okay. Ali is here joining us today. But these 5 thinkers, in my opinion, if any educator has to look at the concept of colonialization in context, we need to study these 5 teachers, great educators, in order to put things into perspective and to make our efforts more effective, so to speak. There have been, I do need to make a disclaimer with the fact that there are other bases for knowledge that we also need to look at concomitantly with this dynamic. And we need to look at cosmology to be effective, because that gives us meaning in the past. Just 3 disciplines, right? Epistemology, right? That enables us to understand how we're learning knowledge, and eschatology, all right? Another important point we need to make is that the colonial aspect of looking at education doesn't mean the exclusion of the European perspective. The contrast between a colonial model and a decolonized model is the actual inclusion of all the world. So when we're speaking about a decolonized curriculum, we're speaking about a curriculum that respects and considers every layer of the human race in terms of contribution to knowledge, from indigenous knowledge to the commonly accepted Western formats of knowledge and grading and the entire structure, okay? So these are just basics to keep in mind as we're going through these 5 scholars, inshallah. I will indulge you in them right now. The first and foremost, for me personally, is Dr. Chris Wilson. Dr. Chris Wilson was a psychiatrist, and she pretty much gives you the overall structure of white supremacy, which in essence is the big machine as far as the big machine of colonization. You know, I mean, we often see memes and things these days where people speak about slavery being a historic format of colonization, and today neo-imperialism being a current format. So she sort of carves out areas of human activity that we need to look at in order to decolonize our minds, and also to position ourselves in a stronger standing, so to speak. All right, and she speaks about education as the area of human activity, economics, entertainment, labor, law, politics, religion, and sex. So she highlights that these areas is essentially where the white supremacy has had a strong grip, and by controlling these areas, they are effectively controlling the mind. And she wrote a book that we should give ourselves some time to study. And these are the ISIS papers. They're known as the ISIS papers, the key to color. It is very important to go into that. The next mind is probably the beloved of anyone that reads the psychology of colonialism. And this is Frantz Ibrahim Fanon, who was a phenomenal individual, fought in the Algerian War, and sadly died in the custody of the CIA. I think he had cancer. We're actually in his birth month at the moment. And he's written extensively on the psychology of colonialism. And perhaps his most famous piece is The Wretched of the Earth. And this book really goes into the detail of the psychological aspects of colonialism. And for Fanon is special because his mom was white, French, and his dad was of Congolese descent. And I believe that out of the siblings, out of his siblings, the other 4 siblings passed for white, but he was the only black individual. But I think Fanon is quite famous. We all know him from the Negritude movement as well, along with the Beautiful Minds from then. And we also have from Brazil, Paulo Freire, who wrote The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, who's very, very important as well. In terms of education, he really does break down the concept of the oppressed and the oppressor, and the dehumanization and the humanization, right? So he highlights these processes and really brings it to the forth, right? Another individual, and I do know that we are pressed for time, and another individual here is Jane Elliott, who is a phenomenal woman, very strong, very powerful woman. She essentially replicated Hitler's blue eyes, brown eyes experiment. There's actually a film based on these experiments. I mean, she first tried it on her grade 3 class, right? And she did this after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King, who she really admired. You know, she admired his passive approach towards his aggressors, right? Or to the aggressors of the African Americans, to put it in better context, right? So these 4 individuals, in my opinion, give us a very strong base. I'm going to go on to the 5th one shortly, but these 4 individuals really paint the picture for anyone that doesn't understand the concept of colonialism, especially in the context of education, right? And the 5th individual that I would like to bring to your attention, and I mean, this is just an introduction. Seda Nuseba, Nina Alexia Brazio has highlighted that this will be a series, inshallah, and we can unpack all of these phenomenal personalities as we go along. And Dr. Mucholoko Zuluma Thabo Zulu is the 5th one. Obviously, in the African context, it was quite refreshing for me to meet him. You know, he really brought a lot of things that I was unaware of. For instance, in South Africa, that we had a writing system long before the colonial people arrived. So in terms of indigenous knowledge systems, he highlighted so much, you know, and he has mastered both the Western. He's a phenomenal programmer, and he's also graduated from the African University, which is something that I was unaware of its existence at all. I didn't know that as Africans, we actually had the Basotho people and the Zulu Nation and the various Ngoni tribes had universities that, you know, had to go underground when the colonial forces showed up. So this was really breathtaking. He has written a book titled the Sesotho Dictionary of Mathematics. You know, sometimes when you speak about decolonizing education, people say, oh, very well, you can go ahead and decolonize education. What about, you know, what are you going to bring to the table? What knowledge is there that you could possibly bring at a PhD mathematics level, right? And he's just one of those individuals that has come to the table and fed our nation, South Africa, and the world with African indigenous systems that can compete with and probably excel beyond the current Western model of mathematics. So I think perhaps I don't know if I rambled across these 5 individuals, but maybe I should go back to our honorable moderator and yeah.
Shukran to you, Mubarak. Yeah, I think you're right. This should actually be a 5-hour session and not an hour session to really dig into the kind of meat of what happens here. Mubarak mentioned Dr. Chris Walsing, Franz Ibrahim Fanon, Dr. Jane Elliott, Paulo Freire, and Mocholo Zulumata Zulu. These are giants in their own right in their various fields. And I think more importantly, he mentioned interestingly some of the blue eyes, brown eyes experiment. I think is a well-known experiment, and people should read up on it. Actually, it's a good thing that you've highlighted that. Just perhaps quickly before I move on to RIZWANA, in the kind of context that we find ourselves now, and teaching online and still depending on the kind of Northern Hemisphere for knowledge and knowledge production and so on. What in a nutshell, what would you say should or should not happen, Mubarak?
Well, I believe that, you know, we're in a specific system, and whether we want to admit it or not, it is where we are, and the most effective manner, right, in the process. And shout out to all the educators out there having to deal with online teaching. But we should definitely upskill ourselves in that process as we go online and do our best to get.
You don't see online as a colonial construct, do you?
Well, I would say it's a modern construct because it is built, the technology is built on indigenous knowledge. We know that algebra is the primary, is the primary theory for the development of our computers. That algebra is from al-jabr, which means the reuniting of broken pieces. So this is not known anymore, but it is taught as a Western concept. So we believe that computers come from our colonizers, which is absolutely not true.
Thank you very much. Thank you very
yeah.
much. Thank you. Let's move on to RIZWANA. I think it's important. Time is starting to catch up on us. RIZWANA.
Okay, assalamu alaikum to all the viewers out there. So I'm going to explain the need for steps towards a decolonized curriculum in the UK. So I'm a teacher of religious studies in the UK. I teach a mixture of religion, philosophy and ethics, as well as non-religious views in a state-run high school in London. This subject is statutory for all students because the UK does not identify itself as a secular country, though it could be easily argued that it is increasingly secular. Britain sees itself as a Christian country. So as part of my job, I teach all the major world faiths to a mixed, multi-ethnic, multi-religious population in my school. The schools I've taught in have all been in London, and the majority of students in all of the schools I've taught in have been of South Asian heritage. So generally second or third generation Pakistani, Indian, Bangladeshi or Sri Lankan students, with significant minorities from other backgrounds too. I mention this first and foremost to highlight the fact that it is actually my business to talk to our students on a daily basis about their identity, their culture, their understanding of their religion, and their evolving view of their place in the world. something that wouldn't necessarily happen in other classrooms at all. My students often give me quite candid responses about how they feel about who they are as a minority within a society that throws up so many questions and contradictions to the values of their families and their heritage. So recently, when I set my 14-year-old students work on the brutality suffered by George Floyd and the fury they could identify in the protests around the world, and I asked them to research why people in the UK were calling for statues of slave owners to be toppled, I got to read their confusion, their frustration, and their righteous indignation. And I have license to help them probe what that means for who they are as British citizens, to a small degree. I can't do a lot, but I can ask about it at least. So there are a few points that I wanted to raise in my 10 minutes today, though I'm sure I will in many ways be reiterating the points mentioned by my esteemed colleagues on the panel. Firstly, that decolonisation is not just the realm of English literature or history classrooms or textbooks. That may be where we see the lens of a dominant cultural narrative the sharpest, but it exists throughout the education system. In my roles as an advisor for teaching religious studies, and when I've managed departments of other teachers, I often have to challenge stereotypes held by teachers and question their views of other religions. It's not uncommon for teachers to find a version of, say, Judaism or Islam that they believe is most likely the more accurate version of the religion as they believe it should be, and then go and incorrectly present this as a mainstream view, rather than accepting that the religion may be far more conservative than they would be comfortable showing it to be. I recall a particular example where one teacher I worked with brought in a visitor who termed himself a Quranist. His said belief was that the hadith were largely fallible and therefore didn't have to be followed, and one could just use the Quran as a guide to what Islam was. Many today may even agree with this, but this is not a mainstream Muslim view, and many Orthodox Muslims would even deem this to be outside of what is acceptable in Islam. But because there were such valid movements within Christianity, it proved very difficult for me to convince my teacher that presenting this as a viable mainstream alternative to Muslim students was actually extremely problematic. Some students, Muslims and non-Muslim, took this to be exactly as presented and were really pleased to find Islam to be far more liberal than they'd always been taught, welcoming female imams and mixed congregations in the same space. Other students, however, were reeling with frustration. They couldn't express their confusion as they were out-debated by a PhD candidate. They wanted to prove him wrong, but didn't have the knowledge nor the maturity to know what to do with what they saw as an attack on their beliefs. Growing up, it is natural to question religion and how one fits in modern life, but this event made me see the rug being pulled somewhat from under students' feet and it being hailed as a triumph, all the while touting a highly contentious viewpoint. The point here being that there are hijacked narratives in all aspects of the curriculum throughout schooling. To challenge these and to change them is a big job and really takes a lot of patience. But how does a curriculum like this affect students in the UK? Well, for my students, who are perhaps more indigenous English, it results in their version of their society being skewed, albeit where they are seen to be the innocents. So when they see arguments about statues being toppled or historical frustrations around, say, Britain's role in the slave trade, they're unable to piece it together as it's not the version of history that they've been taught. They can't see the subtleties of racism in society as they don't understand their context. They too deserve a more honest understanding of what Britain means to the world. Otherwise, they will see themselves as unjust victims, blamed for everything that goes wrong. We're doing these students a disservice as there is a block for them to understanding who they are and their context and relationships with others in their communities. It doesn't help us in building bridges between the communities of Britain today, let alone between Britain and the international community. As for my many students from migrant communities, I really wonder how this plays in their sense of self. They are from colonised lands, but these children, like me, are born here in Britain and are British. They see themselves as British, they feel British, and they're told that they're British. But at many points of their lives, not least in their schooling, they are othered and they know it. They can see the incongruencies. I've worked in many schools where Muslim children were the majority. And whilst at Christmas there's a big celebration, Ramadan can sometimes be seen as a problem. When Ramadan has been around exam times in the summer over the last 3 years, schools are concerned for students' results, and I saw my school delicately, but actually actively encourage students not to fast, reasoning that it would make them tired during an exam and they won't do as well. This was not a secular stance, nor was it a Christian one. It's taking a religious practice that people generally outside of Islam don't understand and classifying it as an obstacle to be overcome. This disparity is real. There is a fiercely dominant cultural narrative that exists, but when questioned, students and teachers alike are told it's not there, that it doesn't really exist, that the schools or structures are just being equitable, or it has to be this way because it's a secular school. This operates as a form of gaslighting that has at times played havoc with my adult British mind. So what must it do to my students? I once had my lesson observed by my manager and the principal of my school. They observed me teach a lesson to 17-year-olds. The subject of this lesson was how Muslims should use the Sharia today. The examples from the syllabus that I used were smoking and music to illustrate this. I had a class of only children from South Asian Muslim families. It was a tricky topic to teach because many Muslims have an interesting relationship with the Sharia, but it sparked a lot of discussion. They observed my lesson for close to an hour and spoke to all of my students. These managers later said some quite nice things about my lesson, but one key improvement they wanted me to make was to be more mindful of using the third person when I was teaching. This was because I would say things like, well, we might, as opposed to Muslims might. A strange thing to say, really, if you're a Muslim in a headscarf. They believe the language I was using was lacking objectivity, and that I was assuming that all of the students were Muslim, when some of them at that time might be feeling like Islam is no longer for them. As their teacher, I was confused, but that quickly grew into a rage I really didn't know what to do with. I really felt this anger because it dawned on me that the only two people I didn't include in my use of the word we was them. They weren't from Muslim backgrounds, so I was excluding them from the conversation in my lesson. Everyone else had grown up within a Muslim culture, and so, belief or not, they could identify with the disparity between what a religion says and what people then go to do. But a greater fuel of this anger for me was the fact that they couldn't see that my students felt that same exclusion, that othering, every single day of their school lives in other classrooms. There were countless examples of students feeling uncomfortable or misunderstood, but these issues were not aired or just dismissed. Their culture has no capital. As a teacher, I want my students to know that they are enough as they are, and that they bring within them a sublime mix of past and present, and they don't have to twist and mold themselves to live up to an English expectation of who they should be. This version of ourselves is imposed upon them, and they start to believe it. The third reason there's a need for a decolonised curriculum in whatever form is because we cannot understand the present without understanding the past. Extreme exploitation exists today, the inequalities that exist today and the disparities that will now inevitably come as a result of climate change cannot be understood without recognition of what came before. What we teach is a political act and has consequences, so we need to try to make this a tool to some sort of freedom from the status quo. If anything, the last few months has only really served to highlight the inadequacies of the current educational system. If we weren't sure of the cracks before, over this COVID period, they actually became loud and clear. We also saw that sudden and extreme change is also possible. In the UK, at least, most children haven't been to school since March. The gap between rich and poor has been highlighted through a move to online learning, and suddenly exams were cancelled for everybody. Extreme change is an option, and it can work to make things better. So I believe that there's a need for a new type of curriculum or schooling, a rethink of education as it is in its current form. It only serves to perpetuate a view of the world that doesn't and never did exist. It's important that we carry on that conviction from the last few months into the future and see what through some sort of action, be it words of encouragement or financial support, or to be and do something different. It's a time for me, I think, to call for and try something else.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you very much. That's RIZWANA. I'm not going to repeat everything that she said, bar maybe 1 or 2 points, and she's interestingly also raised the issue of statues and its influence on our kind of colonial thinking. She emphasized the fact that the subtleties of racism is still there within the curriculum and needs to be addressed. It kind of reinforces the dominant culture, particularly in the West at the moment. And she used the example of how fasting was used as an excuse almost to tell children that they should not actually be fasting because it impacts on the kind of results of the assessments. Okay, so we don't have too much time, and I really want to get into something, you know, kind of debate, you know, if it's possible at all. Professor Farid, just very quickly, your father wrote about Raffles in 1971. I'd love to just hear your take on it, please.
Well, he wrote a small book on critique of Raffles' political philosophy, and also discussed not only Raffles' views, but also his some of his deeds, or more accurately, misdeeds. And this was, you know, just more than a decade after Singapore became an independent nation. And Raffles was given a sort of iconic status in Singapore by the independent state, by the newly independent government. So I think my father's goal was really to, you know, to question the attitude that Singaporeans had towards this colonial figure, and more generally towards colonialism. You know, does a man who was involved in the drug trade, who presided over a colonial state which benefited from the sale of opium licenses, or who was involved in looting when, you know, Raffles was governor of Java. There was an incident where he had conquered the royal city of Yogyakarta, and looting was involved and some killing was involved. Apparently, Raffles was also involved in a corruption scandal, also in Banjarmasin, in today's Indonesia. So there's such a man, and in more general terms, the legacy of colonialism, does that not deserve critique? And that kind of work, I think, is what we call, it's part of the effort to decolonize knowledge. Yeah.
Perfect, wonderful. Professor, just whilst we're on it, in your opinion, how has the English language been used to promote the kind of in-depth or deep-seated racism within the pre-colonial kind of times? And I'm often referred to the example of Africa being described as the third world, whereas in fact historians and archaeologists and so on would emphasize the fact that in fact Africa was the bedrock of civilization, and yet we are the third and not the first world. So is there a way that the language, particularly English as a language, is used to embed the continued racism and the kind of colonial values that we have today?
Well, yes and no. You know, there are, of course, rhetorical effects of language, and sometimes there's a very pernicious rhetoric associated with language. And it's not just words and terms, but the whole language itself. But at the same time, we find that throughout Asia and Africa, and this of course goes for certain countries more than others, but certainly in Africa, in countries like the Philippines, in India, and certainly Singapore, and Malaysia, and many other countries, and this, what I'm saying, also goes for the former French colonies. English and French have become the language of these people across Asia and Africa, and they have become the language of the oppressor, of the oppressed. The oppressed are using the language of the oppressor to critique oppression, to critique the colonizer. So in a sense, you know, when English or French are used to create decolonial discourse, decolonial thought, anti-colonial thought, we are at the same time decolonizing these languages.
Okay.
So we've made them a strength. We've made it into our strength.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you very much. Mubarak, just for my interest, the Muslim scientists, particularly in the West, have been kind of put on the back burner by almost 500, 600, 700 years. How would you, in your opinion, revive the interest in the contributions of Muslim scientists in particular? You mentioned algebra as an example. What is it that needs to be done to bring back the values that were kind of taught by those illustrious scientists? You need to unmute yourself.
Alhamdulillah. I believe that as educators, we need to find methods of researching ourselves, right? As we given, you're given a lesson plan and we have certain topics, we can research a bit more on what both African scientists and Muslim scientists, Dr. Adi Mazuri speaks about the triple heritage of the African, right? So we need to research and present it to the children as a form of enrichment. So yes, do the normal curriculum that is required by the department, but mention it along. It goes a long way because the kids, don't forget that they'll leave the classroom and they'll go out and say, wow, I didn't know Al-Khwarizmi actually developed, a particular concept that is used in computers now, logarithms. That's the word I was looking for, logarithms. So we need, as educators, we need to be active and bring it to the fore.
But that would that be across the board at public schools and private schools?
Certainly, I believe we're able to do it across the board. That footnote makes a huge difference,
Okay.
an absolutely huge.
Thank you. RIZWANA, if you were the Education Secretary in the UK, can I put you on a spot? What immediate changes would you bring on board that kind of reflects the new view of decolonizing education? And before you answer, maybe I should just mention that we're going to be saying goodbye to the viewers of ITV. It's just about 1 o'clock. So those of you who've joined us, thank you very much for having participated in this exercise, and hopefully you'll join us again next time. RIZWANA.
So I can be free now because nobody else is watching. No, I think I would probably, the thing is, the institutional racism in a lot of schools and colleges and universities is so, I think it's really pronounced. And it's something that I've come to see much more as an adult than I did as a student. And I think before you actually go and change just the curriculum model and what's being taught, you have to change people's mindsets. Like I was saying, when with my teachers, and my teachers, like the teachers that I've taught with, are really passionate. They really want the students to have a really good understanding of religion and to really sort of question the environment around them. So they're coming from a really good place, but it's almost like they're just seeing things. They can't see everything outside of what they already know. So that has to be highlighted to a really strong degree. And I think there has to be a lot of training, a lot of dialogue between different people, different races, different people in charge. So a lot of the structures in place and maybe the teachers below, because amazingly, there are so many Muslim teachers that I know in the UK, so many, but they don't get to the management level, or they certainly don't get to become education secretary. So there has to be that kind of dialogue to open it up and to actually even accept that this is a problem, because that's what I was facing in the examples that I gave. there just was no realization that this was even a problem, that this was even something that the students faced day in and day out, that they felt this. And, you know, as teachers, we are public servants and we're serving our students. And so, you know, really that has to be at the forefront. So I would have probably open it up in that way.
Thank you very much. Professor ALATAS, just something that I always am concerned about, the impact of a predatory capitalist kind of approach to the world at the moment. And what in your view, does the role of the kind of capitalist industrialist strategies that's always in the background play in maintaining the status quo? We shout as much as we want to, and this shouting has happened for almost 100 years now, as we now understand. How do we unpack the impact of the capitalist societies that control the world at the moment? You need to unmute yourself, Professor.
That's a very important question. I think there is a very close relationship between the problem of decolonizing knowledge and capitalism. We speak about the need to decolonize knowledge because we are saying that knowledge is Eurocentric, which is another way of saying that knowledge is colonial in nature. But it is not only knowledge that's Eurocentric, it's also the actual world in which we live, which is Eurocentric. What I mean is the modern capitalist world centers around Euro-America. The major institutions of political economy are controlled by a few countries, such as the United States. International regimes, international organizations like the United Nations, the World Bank and the IMF and so on and so forth, are all run in such a way that they perpetuate the system as it is. Even the education systems, the universities, practically every university around the world is a clone of an American or a British university. Not only in terms of the structure, the mode of governance, but also the curriculum. So there's a very close relationship between the nature of education, the content of education, the way in which education tends to be pro-capitalist, and it tends to accept that the only possible way of living in this world is capitalist. It doesn't explore other options because it is assumed that this is the best system or the only system we can have. So Eurocentric education is also pro-capitalist education. And the sooner we get out of that idea, the sooner we can think about other options.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Camillo, just something that I thought I should just pop another question to you. You mentioned the African University and the work that was done in Africa that's now completely non-existent to me and you, or to me anyhow. Talk to me a little bit more about that, please. You need to unmute yourself, Camillo.
That's all right. All right. So I'll zoom into one example that Zulu Matabo Zulu highlighted. He highlighted to me that the Basotho people had an entire writing system. So I could write your name using their writing system. I was raised throughout using the English alphabet, right? And he actually says that in Africa, children would reach a doctorate level by the age of 9. That's the system that was utilized. So you'd start school just like you started from grade 1 all the way through to PhD level. There was an entire knowledge system, grading system, where we studied plants, we studied cosmology, there was eschatology, and that entire movement had to go underground. So that basically, when he highlighted it, it was mind-blowing to me, and I can only imagine having that as a parallel to what the Department of Education is presenting today. I think it would be phenomenal.
Has much been written about this, Camilla?
Not to my knowledge. Dr. Zulu Matabo Zulu is the only person, and I think you'd have to go onto his website. If you type in Zulu Matabo, Mathabo, Zulu, you will find his work. He's written quite a number of books, very important books in terms of African epistemology, eschatology, and cosmology, you know, and that's basically the building block that you need to transform a colonized curriculum, essentially.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you very much for your contribution. RIZWANA, to what extent has and does the white nationalist agenda, and I think that's an ugly head that's being raised across particularly the kind of Eurocentric world, if I may put it that way, promote and influence the maintenance of this colonial construct, because that's effectively what it does, is to, again, push hard for the maintenance of the status quo and continue to oppress the rest of the world. To what extent does that nationalist agenda, the white nationalist agenda in particular, play a role in maintaining the kind of stronghold or stranglehold rather over the education systems of the rest of the world?
Well, I mean, I guess everybody across the world in terms of international schools look towards the British or the American education system, don't they, as their standard. And a few years ago, we had an education secretary who really kind of dismantled any movement towards including other cultural history, for example. So he had a really strong view that we have to go back to British history and look back at the Tudors and, you know, get to know the different kings and queens in schools. And so any other history, let's just take history as an example, any other history is just a marginal kind of adage to this British history that he thought all of these British pupils who are from totally different backgrounds ought to know. And then everybody else is looking back towards that. Now, he may not see himself as a white supremacist, but certainly, you know, these children are left without a sense of self. And when they go into school, they're not seen, they're not identifying themselves in any aspect of this. And that, in my opinion, and in the opinion of a lot of teachers, that really pushed back a lot of movements that had been done in schools at the time. So it was a real shame, yeah. So that is definitely there as a sort of political move, which I think people feel very strongly about, but they're not sure what to do.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you very much for your contribution there. Mubarak, I think we need to start moving towards closing comments. What would you, as a solution going forward, provide us with?
I think moving forward, we need to collaborate collectively and do an entire unpack. It's such a massive process. It's ongoing. I mean, if the educational model has been colonized for over 500 years, it should at least mathematically take us another 500 years to decolonize it, to balance the equation, you know, at least. So we certainly need to collaborate, unpack what contributes to the curriculum, and see how we can present a universal curriculum without obliterating any specific perspective. You know, moving forward in the modern world in a colorful manner. No? Perfect.
Knowledge is not race-based. I always refer to the example of the university that was existing in Timbuktu, Professor SYED, FARID ALATAS. You remember, it's non-existent, and I was privileged to have been in Timbuktu on a number of occasions. There is no university. In fact, I met a Ghanaian student who trekked from Ghana thinking that the university was still around, and ended up teaching madrasa in Timbuktu and didn't have any cash to get back to Accra in Ghana. You know, that be it as it may. Your closing comments, Professor FARID ALATAS.
Well, you know, it's interesting you mentioned Timbuktu. That's such a good example of the use of language as an expression of a kind of Eurocentrism or Orientalism. You know, when I was growing up, when I was a kid, there was this expression in English, as far away as Timbuktu, or from here to Timbuktu. Because in the European mind, in the English mind, Timbuktu was such a far away, mysterious, unknown, inaccessible place. right? And when we as the colonized grew up with that expression, we internalized that view. You know, we internalized the view that Timbuktu is in the middle of nowhere. And it's only when I became a university student and I realized that Timbuktu in Mali was an important center of education and civilization. And that, you know, the level of the civilization of the Africans as represented in Mali and in Timbuktu was very high. So there's a lot of things that we need to unlearn. So I think my parting comment is that decolonization of knowledge is simply unlearning what we have been taught, which is wrong, and learning the truth. And therefore, everybody's minds, black or white, needs to be decolonized.
Wonderful. Simply put, but very, very effective. Thank you very much. Rizwana, your closing comments.
Mubarak and I were on a conversation a few weeks ago, and I was saying to him that one of the sort of saving graces over these last few months has been the fact that when this Black Lives Matter movement happened, a lot of my students were coming back to me having researched on their own, you know, all of these things. So why statues had to be toppled or ought to be toppled, or, you know, really questioning the history that they've been learning. And I sort of started to realize that although they're not learning it in school, suddenly there's spark this interest, and there's a lot of information out there, and they have this time on their hands because they're at home, and they're really kind of looking into the world. And I was really heartened by that, because actually there is a lot that we can do. Although we're restricted by curriculum, we're restricted by time, all sorts of things, there's a lot that if we give the right tools to our students, they can actually still do. So, I mean, there is a lot of hope, and I really feel that if we take the energy from the last few months and we do something with it, something really good will come.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for those closing comments. Last but not least, and probably most importantly, Nusaiba. You need to unmute, Nusaiba.
Yes, I was waiting to be able to unmute. Thank you very much. This has been such a phenomenal webinar. Thank you all for your talks. They're really impressive, and I really feel that there's so much more to uncover, and enabling each of these perspectives really does create more of the whole of the universal, which actually, like a prism, like a rainbow, we need all of these perspectives to create the whole in our education and decolonizing our minds. Yes, I related to the comment of Professor Farid. I sang in a Oliver Twist play when I was young, and one of the lines is, I love you from Timbuktu and back again. So yes, there's just so many things that we can put together here, and I believe this is the start. And what I think is really beautiful and significant is that I feel a sense of genuine hope and transformation through everyone's voices today, and really finding sustainable solutions, not just complaining or talking about the many obstacles, but we really have had valid solutions and ways that we can actually start creating changes, not only in our minds, but practically. So I believe this is a seed and a catalyst for change, and more people are welcome to be involved in this process from each of our nations, and more countries within Europe, Africa, and Asia too. I would like to also share the meaning behind Rahasia Mafusa, if some of you don't know. Rahasia is one of my favorite words in Bahasa Indonesia and Malay. It means secret. So it's about us uncovering our inner secrets and potentials, really, so that we can be our full potential and express our different varied talents and skills and knowledges for our life experiences. And Mafusa is a root word of mafia. So being half Sicilian growing up, also my Sicilian heritage was a bit of a mystery and a myth as well in some ways. And when I was an adult and actually started investigating more about my heritage, I came to realise that mafia, and the root word mafusa, means perfection, grace, beauty, and sheer excellence. And it also has Arabic roots, meaning place of refuge. So with the combination of these words, it's about reclaiming our own languages, our own words, and actually tapping into all of our potentials and ultimately having excellence and this perfection that we seek with Islam, with our spiritual teachings in Islam too. So I thank everyone, all of the viewers from around the world, Umran TV for being absolutely phenomenal with all of your technical behind the scenes assistance, and live streaming on your YouTube English channel. I'd like to thank ITV for collaborating in this project, which is the largest English-speaking African channel for Islam. This is really wonderful to actually collaborate these nations. And I'd also like to thank all of the listeners in Europe and everywhere that you might be tuning in. Each of the speakers, you have been phenomenal. May this be the start to really actually collaborating even more, strengthening our relationships. So thank you, Shabodien, ROOMANAY. You've been an amazing moderator as usual. And so may we work together in the future webinars that we are organising to continue. So thank you, RIZWANA REHMAN in London, CAMILLO ZIMBA in Johannesburg, Dr. Professor SYED FARID ALATAS in Singapore. Thank you, everybody. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah.